What I'd like to talk about is one of the reasons that I like to get this workshop together is to get people in the room from all the different sectors, from government, from industry, from academia, to try and focus on where are the gaps in what we know, what can we do positively, and how can we focus the effort on the best outcomes as far as biofouling management. So a little bit of setting the scene, why we're here, what is the problem, what can we do? Okay, back to basics. What is biofouling? So essentially a process of absorption, colonisation and development of living and non-living material on an immersed substrate. Anything that's in the sea becomes a potential home for other species. And just as in the natural world, turtles face the problem of biofouling and whales face the problem of biofouling, certainly once we put ships in the water, we face the problem of biofouling. Now, back in 1999, when I was foolish enough to organise the first conference, the International Congress on Marine Corrosion and Fouling in Melbourne, Mike Hadfield gave a presentation, and I've continued to quote this, that to put it in perspective, the biofouling community is not a natural community. So 10,000 years ago, we didn't have ships and barges and docks and floats and pilings to attract that unique biofouling community. And over the period of man's travelling around the sea, it's accumulated species which have special characteristics to be able to grow where nothing else can grow. So not everything can grow on a ship hull, but you've got copper-based paints, you've got to cover the world, you move into dirty ports, so there's a pretty tolerant group of species adapt to this. And then, of course, we build a port. Now, where we once had a mud floor or a salt marsh or a gradual rocky slope, we suddenly put in piers and pontoons and piles, and we create shaded environment. We provide a disturbed environment, which native things aren't well adapted to that. And so these opportunists come in on a ship, oh wow, look, there's all this pile and shade and everything that we can settle on. But it's been a problem that we've faced for many years. You go back to 412 BC and they're talking about anti-fouling techniques at that time. You know, in the 3rd century, the Greeks were using tar and wax to coat their ships. I mean, it's been a problem that's been around for a long, long time. And it costs. I mean, we're still dealing with this. If you look, the global anti-fouling paint market is currently, well, in 2015, $5.61 billion a year. I mean, it's projected by 2021 to grow to $9.22 billion. There's a lot of money being spent on preventing fouling. In Australia, in the last financial year, you know, the cost of anti-fouling coatings sold was $16 million. So there's a lot of money out there being put into this area. And we'll hear more about this from Mike Schultz later in the week, but hull fouling on a ship has an enormous effect on the performance of that ship. And it only takes a small degree of fouling to actually increase the drag on the ship, increase the fuel consumption, and consequently the release of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions to the environment. The environmental cost. Okay, greenhouse gas emissions, all right. The IMO have doing a lot of work in this area, but if we look at the actual figures for greenhouse gas emissions, and if we look at that table, you'll see that in 2012, international shipping represented 2.7% of the global CO2 emissions. Now, if we move through, okay, we're using 247 to 325 million tonnes of fuel every year. Now, if you do the rough calculation, sort of 3 tonnes of CO2 to 1 tonne of fuel, it's a lot. And from Mike Schultz's work, again, moving from just a fouling rating of 0, which is a smooth surface, to 30, which is just heavy slime, increases fuel consumption by 10%. So you can see that biofouling can actually have a significant environmental impact through the CO2 emissions. And we're seeing this, you know, in Australia. The consequence of the warming sea temperatures means that we've just about lost all our macrocystis forests in southern Australia. We have sea urchins moving down the Tasmanian coast in response to warming waters and munching everything as they go, leaving these vast urchin barrens. In Western Australia, the kelps are dying out as well. So there are enormous environmental impacts from this contribution as part of many. Now, this is a slide that I've used for many years, and it sort of summarises the main arguments about marine pest, and I'll talk more about this towards the end of my talk in my soapbox session. But these are the claims widely made that, you know, non-Indigenous species, along with habitat destruction, are leading cause of extinctions and biodiversity loss worldwide. One of the top, in the marine environment, one of the top 5 threats to marine ecosystem function. And then the impacts: ecological, economic, human health, socio-cultural. So there's a strong, very strong push to manage these things. And if you look at this IUCN document, you can actually, reading in there, invasive species have smothered seabeds. Invasive crabs roam the floor, eating everything in their path. Invasive jellyfish have led to the collapse of fisheries, and people have been killed by pathogens carried around in ballast water. So, yeah, it's something that people will certainly have to worry about. Now, Antoine talked about this, that last week it was a very significant date with the entry into force of the Ballast Water Management Convention, which is a great step forward in managing the movement of alien species around the world. And again, a well-worn slide from Chad Hewitt and Marnie Campbell, which compared the percentage of species, alien species found in different places, and the likely vector. So this is based on work in San Francisco Bay, Port Phillip Bay here in Melbourne, and in New Zealand. And you can see that biofouling comes out as the main vector attributed to the movement of alien species in the marine environment. The dotted part of the bars represent things that may have been ballast water or may have been biofouling. So the clear part of the bars is where it was definitely associated with that vector. Where there's the mottled, it could be either. But still, biofouling comes out as the highest. Now, what's the difference between biofouling, ballast water, and biofouling as a vector for moving communities around? Okay, ballast water, you're in a harbour, you pump it in. So you're taking a full sample of the local community. You're taking the fish, you're taking the larval stages, you're taking everything. You may be even sucking in Japanese kelp sporophylls or, you know, starfish, the lot. So you're taking this whole community, you move it to another port, and then you pump it out. So all of this whole community's been released. With biofouling, on most, if a vessel is conducting fairly good management practices, and I would happily quote the IMO biofouling guidelines as a good example of good biofouling management practices, you tend to have a subset of a community. You tend to pick out these biofouling organisms that adapted to actually living on ships and in ports and in disturbed environments. So you end up with typically the barnacles, tube worms, and a few other things. The longer you leave something in a port and the growth develops, the more you get towards a ballast water situation of having a subsample of the local community. So the example on the right, that was after the tsunami in Japan. There was a dock section that broke free and floated right across the Pacific and landed on the shore in Canada. Now this had a whole Japanese community on it. So you had the crabs, you had the seaweeds, you had everything. So at one end you've got a whole community, at the other end you've got a whole community, and in the biofouling, somewhere between the middle and the far right is where problems start to come in. So where a community is allowed to develop through, be it poor maintenance practices or a ship spending a long time idle in one spot, then you're starting to move that community across. Now, if you talk about trading ships, okay, this is something that vessels have been identified as the single most important vector for the dispersal of NIS. I spoke about that. More NIMS introductions are attributable to vessel fouling, yes. The highest relative risks for vessel types were commercial bulk carriers. Now, this relative risk was based on essentially the number of vessels working into an area. So, for instance, in Northern Australia, where we have the bulk iron ore trade, there's a huge movement of vessels in and out, going up to Japan, Asia, coming back. So that vessel is coming from an area where species alien to Australia could establish and move down. So in that terms, yes, those vessel types can be considered a risk. But it doesn't take into account biofouling management. Now, my note on the bottom, on an international ship, every fouling species is a non-Indigenous species on that artificially created, newly formed mobile island. You have a ship, it's got nothing on it, wherever it goes it'll pick something up. And on a national or regional basis, what are the non-Indigenous species depends where you are. So a vessel goes to New Zealand and it's got a few New Zealand natives that it's picked up, and they have this large list of non-Indigenous, many of them will be Australian. You come to Australia, okay, they're all the natives. You move, wherever you go, you know, there's a different definition of what is alien. But the real issue is biofouling per se. Now, this is not new. When you talk about the number of non-Indigenous species moved into Australia, for instance, the top right is a red seaweed that I actually worked on this for my honours many, many decades ago in the Paleozoic, I think it was. But we considered this an Australian native, and at that time it had been found in the English Channel in one place. And so this was one of the first reports of a species being moved around the world. This Australian species had been moved to the UK, and it was a bit of novelty at that stage. Recently, with genetic work, we now know it's a Japanese species that had already come into Australia prior to 1906. The one at the bottom, Hydroides elegans, again, this was described as a new species from Sydney. It just happened that, you know, 1883. Now, if you read through the literature, you find that there was the same species under a different name, not officially named, was rampant in Naples, in Italy, at that time. Now, Italy, Sydney, have Sydney things already got to Italy? No, this thing has been one that's been picked up and already moved around, and its origin is most likely the Northwest Pacific. The graph on the left, coming from the Port Phillip Bay study, shows, you know, back in the 1850s, there were sort of significant detections of alien species. The pulse in the 70s is a little bit of bias because there wasn't a lot of, that was the time that a lot of people looked more closely at the taxonomy of species, so there was a pulse there. I'd be more inclined to think it was linear, but certainly looking at this is from a paper in 1902 talking about the arrival of the European green crab in Victoria, which came in the late 1800s. And here the discussion that someone suggested that it actually came in with fouling. We think it probably came in with dry ballast, but at this time it just talks about it. The medium of old lumber ships, or basically timber ships, attracted to a port in the early 1850s. Many of these vessels were far from seaworthy and been patched with false bottoms which had been riddled with teredo and were fouled with marine growth. affording ample shelter for fry. And this is the case. A lot of those vessels came into Melbourne and the crew went to the goldfields, so these vessels just got left there. So, you know, ideal infection point. Again, you go back to Woods Hole in 1952, which is still really the Bible of marine fouling and its prevention. And they did a big census of fouling species. And, you know, 374 taxa on ships, 830 on buoys, and test services 655. You jump forward to 2010 and the fairly thorough study that Graham Inglis and others did, and came up, they had 95 species on merchant ships and 94 on yachts. So again, it's been something that's been there all along. So, and the other thing, in Australia we have a number of species have been listed as high priority species because of their perceived impact. And if you look back at which species probably came in by biofouling, the bottom we have three, so the bag mussel, the European fanworm and the Japanese kelp. And this is out of, you know, 200 years of maritime transport. Similarly in Europe, if you look at their key species of concern, you find that when you get to biofouling, there's only two species that list. Ballast improvisus, which was first detected in Europe in 1844, and then the tunicate stalaclava in the 1950s. So again, compared to aquaculture, which has been a means of bringing many species into different parts of the world, which then get sped regionally, the actual international trade is fairly slow. And this is a list, again, comes from Graham Inglis's study, which looked at the most abundant species found on vessels, or it's actually the number of vessels with different species. And you go through the list and the first 13 species are all barnacles, and you don't get down to something else until number 23. And there's that Ballast improvisus. It's on 18% of commercial ships. And at number 11, Ballast eburneus. Again, 6% of ships, and something that these two barnacles actually haven't established in Australia. There's a record of improvisus from the 1950s, but has never established. So, to summarise that, you know, ship biofouling, vessels are colonised by biofouling species that are opportunistic traits and environmental tolerances to survive on these habitats. The speciose biofouling community has evolved through the maritime era. And these species contribute to the majority of alien marine species found in any country. Most fouling vectored alien marine species do not cause significant long-term environmental, economic, human health or social impact outside of their impact on ships and infrastructure, and it is a problem. And particularly it's a problem with movement in domestic and regional areas. So it's the small regional boats and the ships that don't need to have high speed and good fuel efficiency that tend to get fouled. And the biofouling management guidelines are an excellent way of managing vessels at all levels. One of the issues we have with the anti-fouling with the guidelines is the underpinning technologies. So it doesn't get into the performance of anti-fouling paints or the relative performance of anti-fouling paints. It doesn't get into the performance of marine growth prevention systems. And in some areas these are quite inadequate. A lot of ship owners will go on economy and they'll put a cheap paint on. They're abiding by the guidelines, but those coatings don't work. To get best performance, you actually have to target the product for your vessel. Ecological impact, I talked about this last time. I won't beat on about this time, but in many instances, biofouling alien species are a secondary impact. So if you build a big marina, which is quite an environmental impact, within that marina you are definitely going to get alien species because you've upset the whole system and you've got all these piers and whatever. So you'll get lots of species in there. Very few are able to penetrate a healthy ecosystem. Domestic biofouling, this is an example of the problems we still have here, that where harbour vessels, we've got an example, bottom left of a harbour tug, complied with anything under the biofouling management guidelines, still covered in mussels. The top right, a yacht sitting in a marina down near the mouth of Port Phillip Bay with Japanese kelp cloaking it, but legally they couldn't do anything about it. That sat there for 2 years, and surprise, surprise, that marina's now infested with Japanese kelp. Bottom right, here's a vessel that we were involved in cleaning up a couple of weeks ago to move around to New South Wales, absolutely covered in Sabella. Now, we were cleaning them all up, and we had to go through all sorts of hoops to actually get the permission to move it, to actually get the in-water cleaning done, to allow it not to be a risk to where it was going. Clean before you go, but we got there. Domestic movements, this is the Japanese kelp. Was introduced somehow, probably by shipping. It was first found just not in the port itself, but halfway down towards Geelong. This is Port Phillip Bay. And it's sort of spread now right around the north part of the bay. But all of those satellite locations are all associated with small boat movements. And in particular, the dot, sort of almost central above 2008, that we know was actually, that's where the mussel farmers are, and the mussel aquaculture is one of the most heavily impacted industries by biofouling and alien species. And we know that the mussel farmers actually moved the Japanese kelp from Melbourne to Port Arlington on one of their vessels. The vessel was still sitting there. It used to sell mussels in Williamstown. Went down there, had covered in mussels. I mean, these are the people that should really be doing more. So domestic foul, how do you best manage it? Effective anti-fouling. So, if I've got a tug, I don't have to spend all this money, but I'll end up with a lot of growth. And clean before you go, the other one. If you're going from Port Phillip Bay anywhere in Australia, you should go out with a clean hull. The problem with anti-fouling paints in Australia is that our regulations are quite imposing, and a lot of our products, because it's so difficult to get new products approved, it can take 12, 15 months to get through the APVMA if you've got the correct package of information. So each year it's easier to renew your old ones, paints, than new ones. So if we go on to the next graphic, this is the number of approved anti-foulings in Australia. And you can see the number, if you go back, pre-2005, most of the paints that are used in Australia are old technology. And it's only, we get to recent years with the new technologies that are in widespread use overseas, and they're only dribbling through. And we've just, had a pulse this year because AkzoNobel have actually managed to get 5 new products through. But for the rest of it, for companies, it's not worth the effort. And we're also, these particular bars represent the different biocides. So the new effective co-biocides essentially are ZPT, zinc pyrithione, and copper pyrithione. And you see they're still only coming in, but Diuron, which is going to be banned in New Zealand, is still a mainstay of a lot of our anti-fouling products. In-water cleaning, we have got very good guidelines on in-water cleaning. The problem is getting the permission to do it. It's got to be approved by a regulator authority. That's not defined, so you end up, is it fisheries, is it the harbour master, is it the EPA? And the one who's most worried about covering their back will be the hardest to get through. 2 will tick off, but the other one could take weeks because they don't want to take responsibility. Onto the soapbox. Okay. Scientific and religious dogma. If you look at all of these introductions to scientific papers, we see claims like non-Indigenous species represent an increasing global threat. They represent a biodiversity, social and economic threat. Everyone just keeps quoting this. If we go back to 1992, E.O. Wilson published a paper that said habitat destruction is foremost among the lethal forces, followed by the invasion of exotic species. He actually was talking about freshwater fish in 3 studies. That got taken up by Wilcove, who published a paper, and their paper became the most cited article ever published in bioscience. So everyone has been quoting that. And it's underpinned. As I say, we keep seeing this thing about biodiversity. Now, if we read sort of Mark Davis's comment, there's been some really good debate recently, earlier this year, in Trends in Ecology and Evolution. And as I say, the claim made a splash 20 years ago and became an object of veneration, but has since been revealed as a canard that only die-hard true believers and the poorly informed continue to invoke. Most recent assessments of biodiversity effects demote invasive species to a subsidiary role. And you start reading it, you'll see these things, but the papers that say all of this don't tend to get quoted in the sort of most popular publications. Here's another example. California have just introduced new biofouling regulations, and their statement of claim had this, in the United States, invasive species are believed to be responsible for $120 billion in losses. And this gets quoted and quoted and quoted. But you look closely, and people don't realise this, crop weeds, 27 billion, crop plant pathogens, 21 billion, cats, 17 billion, crop pests, 14, rats, 19 billion. And the only aquatic species came in, it was basically the zebra mussel down at 2 million. So to quote this in relation to marine pests is not generally a good example. And then they went on and talked about diatoms. Harmful diatoms can have been linked to large-scale mortality in sea lions, and they talk about pseudonychia. So you get diatom slimes on ships, therefore it must be a problem. But pseudonychia is actually a planktonic species, not a benthic species. It doesn't settle as a diatom film. The overbite clam corbula has been associated with the biofouling community on vessels in San Francisco Bay, and has been, these 2 vessels, when you read back, were not active vessels. They were mothballed vessels that have been sitting between 13 and 22 years in one location. So not really typical of general ship biofouling. And the last one, of 250 currently established non-Indigenous species in California, 60% are believed to be introduced by fouling. I talked about that earlier, that most of them are response to disturbance. So what's the real problem? Okay, on vessels, yes, it increases hydrodynamic drag, it reduces speed, it increases fuel needs, it accelerates. It is a big problem on ships. Why are people spending so much money? To the environment, increased atmospheric emissions, and very much the domestic and regional spread of invasive species. If you have vessels moving to areas of aquaculture nets are like fouling settlement traps. They will get infested by any number of ascidians, be they alien or native. So if you're moving vessels in that are heavily fouled, you're going to have a problem. And that's where one of the biggest impacts of biofouling per se is on aquaculture. So economically, again, fouling and degradation of infrastructure, fouling of nets. So my key messages is we need to focus the resources for the greatest benefit. So identifying what are the really significant impacts. And there's not a lot of information. When you start drilling into it, I'm still looking to find outside of freshwater environments and outside of island environments in the general world, in native ecosystems, there's not much evidence of impact. So, and then determine the strategies. So the IMO biofouling guidelines, number 1. Think about how you can better manage fouling to reduce fuel consumption, manage the domestic spread. We need improved anti-fouling technology or implementation of existing better anti-fouling technology. Paints, sea chest design is another big issue, and also the way you manage biofouling in sea chests. And trying to work out, get in-water cleaning approval procedures lined up so that it's not a pain for people to actually, who want to do the right thing, to actually do it. So thank you very much, and